Hello and welcome to Rushing the Field, a weekly national college football show hosted by yours truly, Nicole Auerbach. He's Joshua Perry, and you can listen to us anywhere you get your podcast. You can watch us on the NBC Sports YouTube page as well. And Joshua, lots to dive into after, I'm going to say, 4 blowout games in the first round of the college football playoff. We did want the games to be a little bit better.
Yeah, I was disappointed in the outcomes of the games, particularly how they looked. I'm always excited when we have college football. And I think all of us were excited to have games that mattered. I think we need to have a conversation about this format, which we'll get into a little bit later.
We will. So I was at one. I watched Notre Dame beat Indiana. The score was the closest of the 4 first-round games, but Indiana was really not in that one. That one counts as a blowout for sure. Then we saw Penn State blow out SMU. Texas Clemson actually ended up, it was close to being a good game. It got to one-score game in the fourth quarter, but then Texas kind of stepped on the gas pedal again and was able to win that one. And then we saw your Ohio State Buckeyes just completely throttle Tennessee in the nightcap. So those are the teams that are advancing. We now have some monster quarterfinal games. We'll start with the 2 where I think we're going to see the lower seed favored heavily in them, and that's going to be Texas taking on Arizona State as the number 4 overall seed. So they had a bye. That game will certainly be an interesting one. It's the last Big 12 team, the only Big 12 team in the bracket, taking on the Longhorns, who looked fantastic on the ground in their game against Clemson. And then you've got the Penn State game against Boise State. That's the Fiesta Bowl. And I think Penn State is going to be, if they're not already, I'm sure the lines are already out. Penn State heavy favorite in that one to get Ashton Ginty and company out of the Mountain West. And then, man, we have 2 heavyweight matchups. I'll be at the Rose Bowl, Oregon, Ohio State rematch. Best game of the regular season, a 1-point thriller that the Ducks won. Ohio State coming off a game. We'll get into this in just a second of how good they looked against Tennessee and how much they look like a national championship bet favorite, maybe contender for sure, coming out of the first round. And then Notre Dame and Georgia in the Sugar Bowl, also a heavyweight battle. Oh, Penn State is a 10.5-point favorite against Boise State. Okay. So we'll talk
about it.
Yeah, yes. The issues with the format lead to that, where the 6th seed is favored by a touchdown and a half against Boise State in the next round. Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. But I do want to talk a little bit about these blowouts that we saw, because there has definitely been an overall narrative about them and expectations, or how much you should hold responsible the selection committee for the fact that we didn't have very competitive games. So the average margin of defeat was 19.5 points, or sorry, 19.2 points. I would like to say, for reference, this does happen in college football. The average margin of games in the CFP era was something around this as well. It's part of the reason that people wanted to expand it. I mean, we didn't have that many close games, especially in the semifinal round in the 4-team era. And for a reference point, the 2023 NFL wildcard weekend average margin of victory was 17.3 points. So we do get blowouts in sports, and we do get blowouts in college football. But why did everyone react the way that they did?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing. First off, I understand throwing the NFL wild card thing in. I saw it floating around social media. I don't want my sport to be anything like the NFL, so I'm not even.
I know, but it's just the point that, like,
I get what
you're
saying.
Yeah,
right, and that's a league known for parity too, right? And so I do think it serves a purpose to talk about. Well, sometimes teams just have a bad day, and one team plays a great game. I understand that completely. I guess my issue is this idea of, like, we had seen snoozers in the, first iteration of the college football playoff. And we're like, oh, we'll just add more teams and the games will get better. And I'm like, I don't know if that's exactly the way that it works. But in particular with this format, which we'll address, it wasn't set up to have like a bunch of evenly matched games in the first round because of how the teams ended up being seeded. So that was ultimately a flaw. And then, as you mentioned, with a couple of these matchups coming up, we've got 2 that I think are going to be really good games. We saw the first one, Ohio State and Oregon at Autzen, ended up being a really good game. I think we'll get more of that. And Georgia and Notre Dame, I feel like, can be a very good one. You've also got 2, due to the format, that might not be great games. That's a problem to have in the second round here. People were upset, and I think all of the anger is misdirected. We had folks that were mad about which teams were selected. And I'm very much of the thought process after watching these games that maybe Alabama does play better than Indiana and SMU. Like maybe they do. Maybe Ole Miss does as well, and maybe South Carolina does. But you lost too many damn games for me to feel bad. You did not deserve to be in that field. But there is a flip side of maybe Indiana wasn't actually good enough. Maybe SMU wasn't actually good enough to be in the field. And so this ain't really a selection problem to me. Like it might be the fact that this is a bloated playoff, and in a sport where even in a year where we've probably seen the most parity, it's still not very even. These are some of the likely outcomes that you might see in the first round games. You get a team like Ohio State, and the only reason they're seated where they're at is because they absolutely crapped the bed against a team that they should have beat by 20 points. Yet, like they might turn it on and end up, boat racing a team like Tennessee that I do think is good. The sport is weird, and I feel like a 12-team bracket is going to be a difficult thing in many years.
I'm just going to say it. I think it worked. I mean, the lower seeded teams lost. 9 through 12 lost. So, I mean, I'd still rather them end their season by losing on the field.
But they sold me on upsets, and they sold me on great games, Nicole.
I want great games too. I totally do. But I would have loved to see one of those upsets, right? Just to see it happen. But the 4 teams that hosted games certainly benefited from home advantage, like 100%. From playing on campus. You felt it. You heard it. We saw so many SMU penalties when they were facing the Penn State student section. You heard all of those SEC mock chants at the shoe from Ohio State fans. So that is not going to decide these games, but it definitely was a factor. It helped the higher ranked team. But my point is, I still feel better that Indiana didn't get told by a bunch of people in a boardroom, you're not good enough to play for this. And then, we have to sit through some meaningless bowl game that they're in that they don't really care about. So if they lose and they, are not good enough to play for a national championship, well, that was determined on the field. So I'm okay with that. I get what you're saying. I would love to see more competitive games, but I think it's the overall point that the cutoff line of actual national championship caliber teams this season was the 8 seed. Because Ohio State certainly is good enough to win a national championship at its high end. And we saw that, and that played itself out. And again, there's some seeding issues with Boise State and Arizona State that maybe they're not that category. We don't know yet. We haven't seen them play yet against these types of teams. But I think it's okay that the cut line was where it was, because we're not going to go back down to an 18 playoff. And if you had an 18 playoff, the way that it's set up, that it would have been set up with 5 conference champions, Ohio State's not in it. By the way, they're the 4th highest at-large team. So I get that the games were not competitive. I wish that they were. That is a seeding problem. That is not, I don't think, the size of the bracket. But we also have to remember, Joshua, the way that they set this whole thing up and the reason they did it in the first place was not because a team that was good enough to win a national championship was being left out. Like going from 2 to 4, that was, I think, the main goal, right? Your team, the first year of the playoff, proved that if you had the BCS system, the best team in the country might not have been playing for a national championship. The reasons they expanded this were, engagement throughout the season, access for more teams. It wasn't necessarily saying like, oh, the 10th seed is going to win a national championship, is going to get through 4 games to win it. I know that that's not, again, maybe that's not like a great thing. And I think a lot of people will disagree, and they want the best teams, and they want 12 teams that they think can win it all and can get through 3 or 4 games. But that's not why this thing was expanded. So the deserved and the reasons that people were selected was still adhering to the principles about why they did this in the first place.
It's really hard for me to feel good about a collective group of people who said that the best way for us to crown a champion, which is the most important thing in our sport, is to think about engagement during the regular season. Right? Like that is stupid to me.
Well, they wanted more teams to stay alive, to be engaged in the season.
I understand that. But like I watched Ohio State and Tennessee play last night, for example. Tennessee players going down left and right. And let's say that game was close and Tennessee ends up winning that. And they were a team where you're like, okay, could they make a run? Well, the idea that you're making them play all these games because you wanted more engagement in the regular season, now they got guys hurt, is stupid. Like it just, I'm really struggling to see how this is the best way to determine the champion of college football. And I like I said, I love games that matter. I like the idea of having these big time campus atmospheres. I love what they're doing with the second round and the bowl sites and everything. Like, there are a lot of things I do appreciate about this. And I'm not trying to say like this is going to turn me off from college football. That would be stupid too. But the idea that it's like, okay, we're trying to crown a champion and this is our best approach. Like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
A lot of things in the way that college football works don't make a lot of sense. Like,
no, they don't.
This is a compromise. This took all of these commissioners and all of these different conferences with different competing interests to come up with the model the way that it is. And it doesn't work the way that it's set up because you have mega conferences and you have imbalanced schedules within them. So that's part of the reason that, Indiana goes to 11-1. And of course, an 11-1 Big Ten team is going to get in, but they didn't play the schedule that Ohio State did. Again, Indiana deserved to be there. SMU deserved to be there. You are in the bracket based on what you did prior to Selection Sunday. What happens afterwards might make you feel better about picking someone or feel worse about picking someone to be in the bracket, but it doesn't mean that they didn't deserve to be in there. But the thing is, the issue is the seeding. So because seeds 3 and 4 are not third and fourth best teams in the bracket, it messed up the first round games and it messes up Oregon's path as a number 1 overall seed. We talked about it. They have a hard path. They have to go through what Ohio State is now the second highest odds to win the national championship, and Texas is the highest. Then it's Oregon. So they have to go through potentially Ohio State, Texas, and Georgia or Notre Dame to win a national championship. And I get it. It's supposed to be hard. You are supposed to beat good teams to do this.
Sure.
But you're the number 1 overall seed. And Penn State right now, they blew out SMU, and now they just have Boise State standing in the way of a semifinal appearance. That's not the loser of the Big Ten championship game. Like, people are going to say that they could cakewalk into the semifinals, and Oregon has to go through Ohio State to get there. Like, that part seems unfair.
No, it's terrible. Like, it's again, like you said, you got to beat good teams. I don't feel good about it though. Like, it is a really difficult spot to be in, and like I know Oregon's going to be up to the challenge. You and I are familiar with Dan Lanning and how he loves to run that program. People have seen kind of the way that he motivates, but that is not a reward for how they played this season. And they were the only team that was able to make it there unscathed, right? Like, it's definitely difficult. I want to push back though on this idea that like seeding is the reason, like it's part of the reason that these games were bad, I think, in the first round.
Let me tell you what they would have been. Can we go through what they would have been? Okay. So if you had done, now there's a couple different ways to fix this, right? People have talked about reseeding, which would have worked, right? Because then Oregon would be playing Arizona State in the quarters, which feels fair, right? Sure. Fair reward. But if you did it in the first place, so you say, hey, the 5 conference champions get in, but then we just rank them 1 through 12. This is what the games would have been. And there could still have been blowouts. So I agree with you. This would not have solved all the problems. But the 5-12 game would have been Notre Dame, Clemson. 6-11 game is Ohio State, Arizona State. Tennessee is the 7-10 game, Tennessee hosting SMU. And then Indiana hosting Boise State in the 8-9 game. So in this scenario, Oregon, Georgia, Texas, and Penn State get the byes as the 4 highest ranked teams by the committee. So listen, Notre Dame could blow out Clemson, or maybe it would be more interesting because Clemson's quarterback and the offense could be really good.
No doubt.
But Notre Dame would probably run through them the way that we saw Texas do it.
Yes.
Ohio State could crush Arizona State, but it's interesting because Arizona State's hot coming into the matchup.
No doubt.
Tennessee, SMU, and Indiana, Boise State, I think could be really good games.
I wouldn't disagree with that either.
So I think I agree with you that like it doesn't solve everything, but doesn't that feel like a more fair bracket?
Yes, 100%. I think I agree with that. Like if you would just done 1 through 12, which we had talked about, it would be a more fair bracket. I'm also kind of on the like, just take the top 8. Just take the top 8. But they're never going back to that. I'm just going to have to get used to this world of the postseason being set up in a way that I just don't think makes a ton of sense, and just hope that we can get great performances from the teams that are in there so I don't feel as bad about it.
Do you think that the selection committee is responsible for if the games are good or not?
No, the selection committee has parameters that they have to operate within, and they have a job to do. And it's to pick the 12 teams that go in there within the parameters. And I'll address this because there was a bunch of Alabama fans that were mad. And like I said, I don't think your team deserved to be in there. But if they were going 1 through 12, Alabama would have been in there, right? So like this isn't a get mad at the committee issue. This is a structure of the college football playoff. I can't say I have too many issues about what they did. Like if they believe that those were the teams ranked in the place where they really saw them, and then they had to seed them based off of what the parameters are. I don't know what more you want out of the committee. I think they did what they had to do.
Okay, so as the blowouts were unfolding, especially the first three, so poor Indiana again becomes a flashpoint in a debate against, kind of college football and like the most deserving camp versus the SEC and their love for hypotheticals, right? So during the Friday night game, you had a bunch of people saying like that they believe, Alabama's not in. Alabama could have played Notre Dame better than this.
Whatever.
Yeah, you could all of
we
that.
We don't know that, by the way. Alabama lost 3 games on the road this year, and there was one game where they had as many interceptions as points. So I'm not trying to hear that, really.
There was a lot of that during the SMU game. And honestly, to your point, that was basically Jalen Milroe against Oklahoma is what happened to Kevin Jennings against Penn State.
Absolutely.
Very similar kind of blowout loss. But yeah, Alabama could have easily gotten blown out. They were wildly inconsistent. So anyway, that was a crazy conversation all along. Meanwhile, you had Lane Kiffin, head coach at Ole Miss, another team that got left out, tweeting through all of it. So he was tweeting during all of these blowouts. And this one was during the Penn State SMU game. He tweets, "Way to keep us on the edge of our seats, committee, ... riveting." So he kept doing this. He was going at the quality of the games.
You know what was riveting? Was when they lost to Kentucky. That was riveting.
Or
the
Florida.
Way they lost to Florida, that was riveting.
So then he starts cheering for Tennessee going into the game against Ohio State. Again, narratives, et cetera, et cetera. He's retweeting quotes from Paul Feinbaum, who says, quote, "So far, the CFP selection committee has given us some blockbusters, ... take a bow." So again, all of this was like through the first 3 blowouts when you had 2 ACC teams lose and Indiana lose. These were the lowest seeded teams in the bracket, by the way. Like, they are supposed to lose. People did not pick them to win these games. And then we get to the Tennessee game and Ohio State just absolutely destroys them, completely outplays them, outclasses them in all the different areas. And Lane Kiffin does not tweet again the entire night.
Oh, what happened?
Yeah, it was a little bit. Everyone's like, should we send someone to his house? Like, is he all right? But that narrative was insanely frustrating. But it's kind of the whole conversation we've had for weeks now distilled into one thing where the SEC media apparatus, the fans, Lane Kiffin, trolls, everyone related to it was just saying, well, our teams would be better. The hypotheticals again. Meanwhile, like you have data points where you play badly against worse teams that were in the playoff. 6-6 teams that are barely bowl eligible. And that was infuriating because, again, it doesn't invalidate someone making the bracket if they go and lose, because 11 of these teams that made the bracket are going to lose games. And all of a sudden it had to be this referendum on their entire season and their worth as a team. Like, it was crazy to see the way that people were talking about Indiana after they lost to Notre Dame, a team that I have in my bracket playing for a national championship.
It's funny because I've got Alabama fans that are still in my mentions as we're recording this. And it's like, dog, you might have had an argument if Tennessee would have gone into the horseshoe and would have beat Ohio State. Like, I might be like, okay, we can entertain this potentially. Tennessee got run off the field. It was 21-0 at the end of the first quarter. Ohio State rolled 4 quarterbacks into that game. They started putting the backup quarterbacks in with 10 minutes left in that football game. It wasn't close. It was pure domination of your SEC third best team in that conference. And Ohio State finished 4th in the Big Ten, by the way. Like, it's done. I've given the SEC benefit of the doubt too, just as somebody who understands how like players make teams, they make coaches, like they are very talented teams. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to give them all of the benefit of the doubt when it comes to who should be in the postseason. Like, I can't overlook certain losses. And at a point, there has to be a penalty for losing games, and in particular, games that you have no business losing. And so, like, I understand this, well, who did they beat thing. Like, I think winning is the most important thing in the sport. But you get no leeway, and I will not shed a tear when you have not proven on a week-to-week basis that you can do the winning things it takes against competition that's not very good. So Like, congratulations for the engagement that you guys are going to get this weekend. But like, I don't know many people outside of the South that really feel bad about the teams that were in the field this year.
No. And again, to your point, Ohio State crushes Tennessee. Tennessee beats Alabama. It's a pretty open shut case when you look at it that way. When you were fighting and arguing that teams below Tennessee, worse than Tennessee, deserve to be in, and that performance happened. So it did quiet some of it. Although you still had people like Kirk Herbstreit and others saying like, we're just looking at the total number of wins and putting people in this bracket, which completely it devalues the regular season. If you're saying that you should not consider who people beat or lose to in the regular season, then you are talking about just picking teams based on their rosters in August. And I don't understand that. I mean, there were some good jokes though. People were like, here's a leaked bracket of next year's CFP, and it was only SEC teams because they're the only ones that are the best. But that stuff was really frustrating. And I just think it does a disservice to the sport. And it was frustrating that overwhelmed the storylines of the games, how good some of these teams were. And by the way, teams that didn't have great wins included Penn State.
Yes.
Included Notre Dame. Included Texas. And
yes.
By the way, those teams all certainly look like they belong and made up for the shortcomings on their resumes and got the ability to host these games. It was a frustrating weekend, but the good that we saw were the on-campus games were phenomenal. That part was awesome. The atmospheres were great. The broadcast did a great job of showing a lot about what makes these games special. You could hear the fans really well. You saw the bands, you saw the cheerleaders, you saw the pomp and circumstance around these games as well. One just quick note before we get into kind of like what we learned about each team is the ratings, because, we don't talk about it all the time. I think that people are getting a little bit too obsessed with ratings, but this was the one that I was interested in because they went up against the NFL games in the 2 early windows on Saturday. So our friend John Arand from Puck, he said the overnights were that the afternoon games on TNT, Clemson, Texas, and SMU Penn State, 3.1 million viewers, and then 3.6 for Clemson, Texas, did not help. Those games were blowouts. The later games, so the Friday night game, 5.7, 6.3 for the Ohio State game on Saturday night. And the NFL games were in the 7 million range. So I think basically you could say that the college games cut into the afternoon NFL games probably a little bit. Would have been more interesting to test it out if the games were close. I think that YouTube TV gave people the option to have like a multi-box with both, which I thought was great. Because I would think if you're a football fan, you'd want to watch all of it that was happening. But that's just a quick note. I don't want to make any sweeping comments. I think a lot of people are coming to conclusions off of one weekend, one time.
That's me.
And saying that things are broken or that things need to drastically shift when like we have the smallest of sample sizes right now.
Yeah, and it is a small sample size. And I try to keep that perspective. It's just like, I think this was what I had feared and I had kind of predicted about stretching the thing out to 12. I've never really believed that there were 12 contenders, but like you make the point that it wasn't necessarily about that. And maybe that's where my source of frustration really should be. Ultimately, like I said, you could not create better environments. And like, I'll just lean into my alma mater real quick before we get into these recaps. But people have long said that the game day atmosphere is not great, especially for the size of that stadium and the size of the fan base. And playing at noon has been tough. They had drone shows. They had 2 bands out there dotting the I. The fireworks, like they did everything they could to make that one of the best environments that Ohio Stadium had seen. And that's why this is a big deal. It's like, it's important to be able to host a game on campus and go out there and show your best.
Totally agree. Notre Dame was amazing. It was electric. I loved the snow. I saw people tailgating in the morning in 30-degree weather. It was fantastic. It was where college football lives. It lives on campus and those traditions. And, we're going to see for the next 3 rounds, neutral sites and bowl sites. It's going to feel different. It's going to look different. But Joshua, wait, I did have a question. So they did have 2 bands? I was wondering what was happening there. It looked like way more marching band members than usual for Ohio State. So they had 2 bands do it together?
They dotted 2 I's.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Big deal.
I loved it.
Absolutely. You got to do twice the pageantry for a game like that.
twice the pageantry, especially to make up for the Vol fans that went there and then had to leave. Very upset, but it was a good bit of orange. What did we think? Like 30%?
Yeah, whatever it was. I heard about some invasion or some takeover. I was in the airport earlier today flying back. It was a lot of them. They were cordial but sad. So takeover didn't go as planned.
All right, let's start going into the games and the takeaways from these teams. You want to get us started on Friday?
Yes, I will. And we'll go with the one that you attended, Notre Dame hosting Indiana. Notre Dame victorious in that one, 27-17. The final score of that game is a liar. It was like 27-3, very late in that game. And Curt Cignetti, never quit type of coach, goes out there and tries to pull off some sort of a comeback, wasn't successful in it. I'll just start with this, is we talked about Notre Dame and their composition. And it was interesting watching how their defense was able to take the football away early, but Riley Leonard also threw the early interception, right? Like, they are a defense run the ball team, but the question has been the throw game. And if they do ever get behind, how does that work out? My thing about it is I'm not sure that they're going to play a game where they get behind. They've got Georgia coming up next. Georgia slightly favored, and that one is basically a pick 'em right now. They got a quarterback question. Like, I'm not sure this is a team that's going to stretch out a lead on them. Notre Dame looked really good. They looked very confident, a ton of energy. I know you were in that building, so you can speak to that. But, Indiana, for all the good things they had done this year, they met a team with a roster that was just better, and they had to go on the road to do it into an environment that was excited to host them. And Notre Dame came out there and proved what they needed to.
Yeah, I mean, we've said this. This was our big concern about Indiana hanging in that game in the first place, was they've struggled when they've gone up against guys that are going to be pros, and Notre Dame, bigger, faster, stronger, more athletic. And it happened over and over again because, they were just able to get to the perimeter and then take off on Indiana. Right. And I thought that could happen. It did. They were so physical defensively as well. I mean, it was just a really rough day for Curtis Rourke, who we've seen have some really great performances, been huge for Indiana season. And then there was some they had bad field position because the punting was terrible.
Oh, yeah.
That was bad. There were some some calls that were interesting from Curt Cignetti, who had gone on College Game Day and said, we don't just beat top 25 teams. We kick the, blank out of them. And it was surprising then to kind of get a little bit conservative in the play calls. There was a punt late in the game that people were also critical of. So it was strange. This was a very confident team as well, but it didn't play that way. The approach to the game wasn't quite that. And again, I just think it had to do with Notre Dame's physical defense. All levels of that defense were on display. Obviously, Xavier Watts had the interception. That I think that interception and the Jeremiah Love 98-yard touchdown run, game was over, right? That if you only watch two plays from that game, those were the two plays. And the rest of the game was Notre Dame controlling the game the way that Notre Dame does. So I think there were a lot of people that probably have not watched a lot of Notre Dame since NIU. And I think they realized, this is a really, really good football team.
Yep.
And it's going to be a really interesting matchup against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl, because Georgia is very likely, I know Kirby Smart hasn't officially said it, but very likely going to be playing their backup quarterback, Gunnar Stockton, making his first career start against this defense.
Yep.
So it's a very, and then, Georgia and what they were able to do against Texas's run game, very effective against Notre Dame's elite run game. So we're going to get into that as we get closer to New Year's for sure. But it's pretty enticing when you look at that quarterfinal matchup.
I tend to agree with you there. And I like what you said about kind of the encapsulation of the game with the two plays where it's it just that was what it was. And for all that Indiana had done well all year, I will say I thought this was their worst offensive game plan. It was, slants and back shoulder fades and not much else. They didn't do a ton to help the offensive line protect Curtis Rourke. I'm watching other teams out here that maybe had some questions about their offensive line, and they rolled the pocket. They did some hard play actions. They just, max pro 7-man protections just to try to take the stress off of the offensive line. And Indiana didn't have a lot of that to their game. They came in and just kind of said, we're going to do what we typically do, which is not the approach that I would have taken knowing what Notre Dame was going to give them. But as you mentioned, Sugar Bowl coming up, Georgia sitting right there. And Kirby, is going to get to do something that he did when it didn't even make any damn sense. And he's going to say, people don't believe in us right now. Because I do think there are a lot of people who have watched Notre Dame and said, you know what, they played really great ball and they came out there. And part of the reason I hate the discourse about whether Indiana should have been in or not, Notre Dame's a great team. And Kirby's going to go into his locker room and be like, we're underdogs, they hate us. And I'm curious to see how that works.
And they're already slight favorites, by the way. 1.5.
Well, it doesn't matter. They were underdogs when the lines came out initially, and that's all that matters. So when Kirby's smart, he will leverage that to his benefit. All right, let's talk about this other one. Went down in state college. Penn State 38, SMU 10. Wow. I mean, I'll say this, and this is the Penn State hate takes again because I've kind of been on it all year. I thought they took a step offensively in the Big Ten championship game. And I didn't quite see that on Saturday. The thing that was much better was their secondary. A couple times got run by like something I expected. They took the ball away. They played pretty well. And that defensive line helped them out a ton because they were able to harass SMU all day. It's a team that certainly, and we see this with everybody maybe outside of Oregon, they got flaws, but they also lean into what they do really well, and it's been working for them.
I completely agree. In the beginning of the game, SMU was moving the ball really well, and it looked like it was going to be a game. You have a dropped touchdown, and also you could have just converted on a 4th down, 4th and short, and they go for the home run play, go for the touchdowns dropped. That changes the game, and then obviously the interceptions by Kevin Jennings, who I was shocked that he played so poorly.
Same here.
Like if you had said, recipe for an SMU loss, that would not have even have been an option because I was just surprised to see it the way that it was. And so, even when SMU was still decent at moving the ball, Penn State was getting stops and they were getting turnovers. And then you didn't really need to do a ton offensively. No passing touchdowns, didn't need them because you had pick sixes and you were able to run the ball. I mean, it was a dominating effort, but this is another one where I don't think the score was entirely reflective. Like I actually think it was a closer game at halftime into the third quarter than the score looked because of the pick sixes. And it was basically a 21-point swing at the start of the game, like in the first quarter.
No, I tend to agree with that. I felt like Penn State played well, but I don't know. I have that Penn State in the Big Ten championship image in my mind, and it didn't look like that performance from them. So yeah. I'm curious to see here because as they move on, like we said, it's on a silver platter for James Franklin and company. They've got Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl. Like that's another one where they could probably play a B- game and still win it. Like I don't think. Now, this is not to disrespect Ashton Genty, but like with Penn State's front, like I don't think he's just going to get loose all over him. And so I'm curious to see as this team keeps coming along, 10.5-point favorite in that game, how much better will they look than some of the moments that we saw against SMU?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, the path, it really is open for them. And they're in the part of the bracket with Georgia, the number 2 team in the country, who's not going to have a starting quarterback. Right. So that's the half of the bracket that they are in. So they're really well positioned to keep building. And again, the run game has been so encouraging from the Big Ten championship game to this. Like this offense for a good portion of the regular season was just whatever Tyler Warren was capable of doing. Yes. And now they have real options. And I think that's really encouraging. So very impressed by Penn State, which again, hadn't had a big win all regular season. They'd had some fine wins, but this was a statement. This was significant. And all of those SMU millionaire boosters got stuck and they couldn't land in that small state college airport with that small runway. And a bunch of them missed the game, which might be better for them to have not seen it. But it was funny to see like the revenge of James Franklin's short runway here.
That's right. That's right. We don't forget James Franklin. That runway helped you out this time, my guy. You need to thank the runway.
It did. So yes, congrats to Notre Dame and Penn State. They are through to the quarters. Cannot wait. Penn State, like you said this earlier, Penn State is a 10.5-point favorite against Boise State as we're recording this in the Fiesta Bowl, which seems like a bad thing. The 6th seed should not be favored by that much over the 3 seed, as we said earlier. All right, let's talk about the last 2 games that we saw this weekend. The most competitive game of the weekend was Texas and Clemson. The winner of this game, which obviously was Texas, is going to play Arizona State in the Peach Bowl. That one's going to be a fun one as well. Although, again, so you've got the number 5 seed favored by 13.5 points against the number 4 seed. So wow. Vegas feels pretty confident in the top 2 at-large teams. But let's talk a little bit about how this game was won for Texas. They were running the ball at will. They were able to do whatever they wanted. 292 rush yards, 6.1 yards per carry. Clemson's run defense was a problem all season.
Yep.
And Texas said, great, here's what we are going to do, and you will not be able to stop us. And then that's what they did.
Yeah, and I'll say this, like if Texas can run the football like that through the duration of the playoff, I understand why Vegas really likes them as the favorite to win it all. It takes so much pressure off of Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers has been underwhelming this year, and I think Steve Sarkisian, and I've talked about this before, I think Steve Sarkisian has done a masterful job of trying to create offense for him through formations and through motions and through route running to where guys are open, and it's an easy read for Quinn Ewers. But when it's kind of like drop back, win it on your arm, he hasn't really been that guy. And he had the ankle injury. His mobility has suffered. And so when it's just like his game to go out there and do it, they're not great. When they have this going on, almost 300 yards on the ground, Quinn Ewers is like all-American quarterback, right? And so, like, I think this is the idea of the complementary offense for Texas that really comes through. I thought Clemson challenged them in a lot of ways. Again, you said most competitive game here. I would tend to agree with that. And I had Clemson pulling off the upset, obviously didn't get it done. But the one thing that I thought was they would be able to challenge the Texas defense. Cade Klubnik was playing some of the best football that we had seen at the quarterback position all year long. And I feel like the issue for them, it was too much of him, right? Like a lot of it came down to his ability to create and to play make. But certainly for a game where the margin looks like it's pretty big, it was a fun game to watch. Clemson jumped out early. We saw Texas kind of look like a championship team here. So I appreciated that one.
Agreed. And it was a 1-possession game in the fourth quarter. And then Texas broke off a long run and the game was over. And so it was one of those kind of days. But I actually feel decent about Clemson moving forward.
I do
with
too.
What we saw from Cade Klubnik, with Dabo Swinney's ability and interest in using the portal to replenish.
They're kind of getting back now.
Yeah, they could be back. They're going to be a team we're definitely going to talk about this offseason. So again, Texas is going to play Arizona State. That's a red hot team to finish the season in the Peach Bowl. That'll be a fun one. Hopefully that spread is wrong, and hopefully that game is a lot closer than some of these first round games. Vegas was off on the first round games. There were a lot of them were like a touchdown spread, and they were not. But hopefully they're wrong on this one. Okay, let's wrap this up by talking about your Buckeyes. We talked about this a little bit off the top. Like, this was a complete beatdown. It was 21-0 in the first quarter. They were getting whatever they wanted. And it was obvious, by the way, right from the jump, that they were going to throw the ball again. They were going to get the ball to Jeremiah Smith. They were going to use the passing game, which we did not see them try to use against Michigan, in part because of the way Michigan defended them, but mostly it was an offensive game plan that left us very confused and very frustrated, having watched Ohio State all season and seen the talent in the wide receiver room. Game plan was great. They were great from the jump. This was a team that had started slow in a lot of games this season. They did not in this environment. Ryan Day seemed happy post-game after the stress that he has endured over the last 3 weeks after the fourth straight loss to Michigan. The number one thing, though, was the offensive game plan, the approach to the game. Joshua, you sent so many all caps texts during the start of this game. Where was this 3 weeks ago? It was crazy after the last time we had seen this team. They were so adamant that they were going to run the ball between the tackles. And then they lose to Michigan. The world is ending. And now we see them come out and throw the ball over the field. And it looked easy. It looked perfect. The speed and athleticism was all over. It was a phenomenal performance for the Buckeyes. It
was phenomenal. It's also super frustrating, like, because of exactly the text that I sent. Like, they could have done this 3 weeks ago, and there wouldn't have been nearly as much like consternation and this tug of war within the fan base about like the direction of the program and who's the right coach and all these different things. All of that to say, they learned from the mistake, and they took the time that they had off to develop a game plan offensively that I thought was nearly flawless. You mentioned early on shots down the field, and Will Howard was spinning the rock. Like, I give him a ton of credit. He threw it probably as well as he did all year long, but they got Jeremiah involved early. They got Emeka Ibuka involved early. They threw it to 2 different tight ends. They threw it to a couple of running backs out there. You saw Carnell Tate get his hands on the ball. And in the times where they did decide that they needed to run it to keep balance, they were using more gap schemes. They were trying to create better blocking angles. We saw the speed option that creased Michigan. They did it again. It was a good running play for them against Tennessee. Like, I think this is what people expected when you heard Ohio State went and identified Chip Kelly as a guy that they wanted with the relationship with Ryan Day, what he does with the run game, when they went and spent $20 million to compose this roster that they felt like could lead them to a championship. The expectation was they could get into a top 10 matchup like this, and they could put up 42 points and hold the opposition to 17 with a late garbage time touchdown there. Last thing I'll say, defense for Ohio State is legit. That Tennessee offense is difficult to defend. They try to stress you with the width of the field. They get the ball out quick. Nico is a big quarterback, a good runner. He's got a good arm. And Ohio State had answers all over the field for them too. I thought it was the most complete performance we've seen from the Buckeyes in probably 2 years. And hopefully for them, as they head into a game, a rematch against Oregon, like this is the one where you have to have the mentality that you can go out there and replicate this performance.
Yeah, this was the game that showed us why it was national championship or bust with this team, with this roster. It was the performance we've been waiting to see. They played really, really well against Oregon the first time, but like we had not seen something like this. And against a caliber, the athletes that Tennessee has, a defensive front that statistically had been among the best in the country at basically everything. We thought that was going to be an opportunity for Tennessee with a revamped offensive line for Ohio State with 2 season-ending injuries. You know, one thing I think we had talked about this going into the game was like they had more time together to figure out exactly how it was going to work. But that unit deserves a lot of credit for what they were able to do and to the time they were able to give Will Howard in the pocket and all of that, because we thought that could be a huge advantage for Tennessee. Just on paper, but that's why you don't play these games on paper. They were really impressive, and that gives you a ton of confidence as well the rest of the way, because yes, you are going to try to replicate this. You're going to try to avoid like the second quarter where they kind of like took the foot off the gas pedal.
Right.
But there were lots of parts of this that were just incredibly impressive and something we have been waiting to see for this. And I think the fans were very excited to see it because you were frustrated with the game plan against Michigan, but you knew that the athletes and the talent was there, and you saw it like kind of all come together against a really good and talented defense.
Right. It's like, you know, you were kind of asking the question, is the plan going to hold them back this time around? And it didn't, right? Like it really elevated them. The coaches did exactly what they're hired to do. And to your point about the offensive line, I give their coach a ton of credit for getting those guys ready. And he's done a good job of doing that throughout the season, but it's hard when you don't have a ton of time off. They did this time. But again, like I go back to the game plan, RPOs, play actions, max pros, moving the pocket. They took the stress off of that offensive line as well. And they let those guys do what was best for their skill set. That's what you do when you're paid $10 million. You get the guys in the right spot.
Yeah, no, the coaching deserves a ton of credit for this, because we talked a lot about the coaching after the Michigan game. I want to talk about a narrative that kind of spun out of the latter part of this game. You know, you're watching it, everyone's watching it, we're all listening to the broadcast. And Kirk Herbstreit, who, of course, played at Ohio State, decided to kind of go on a little bit of a rant when the game was comfortably in hand, after, by the way, spending a lot of the game talking about, you know, the Michigan loss and kind of like what Ryan Day's last 3 weeks have been like and how difficult it is there and how important it is to win that game. He went on a rant and said that the lunatic fringe at Ohio State is as powerful as anywhere in the country. He started saying basically that only the quote the lunatic fringe was upset and calling for Ryan Day to lose his job. And not just that, like the entire fan base expects to be able to beat Michigan, especially when Michigan isn't very good. So he was basically putting this all in like a lunatic fringe, and not like reasonable fans for feeling this way. And then he even went so far as to like take shots at First Take, the talk show on ESPN, saying they thought he was done. So I'll be excited to see what they talk about on Monday. It was a weird rant. And Joshua, the floor is yours. This is your fan base. This is where you beat Michigan 4 times. You understand this place. How did you feel about the way that he was characterizing the angst about Ryan Day and his tenure and his future?
So I'll say this before I get into it. Love Kirk. He's been a great mentor to me. I understand where he's coming from. I get disappointed when people get up here and tell fans how to behave like they shouldn't have standards and expectations for their program. Like, I don't think it's lunacy to say that we've watched the same thing happen 4 years in a row, and in particular with this one, a not very good Michigan team, and we're just supposed to accept the results and, it's a 12-team playoff and I'm supposed to feel fine about that. Like, there are certain things that are expected, and the players and coaches are very aware of it because they talked about it all year, and they didn't do 2 of the things on that list. And I don't think it's crazy for people to feel a way about that. Haven't won a Big Ten championship in a very long time. Haven't beaten Michigan in a very long time. There's going to be a 4-year class of players that haven't done those things. I think fans are allowed to feel a way about that. So I understand, like, there's lunacy in this fan base. I think it exists anywhere else. I don't think that Ross Bjork, the AD at Ohio State, was also going to make a decision based off of what people said on Twitter. And if he was going to do that, it's probably not the right job for him. I'll go also and say this. Nick Saban had some comments about this whole thing too, where, he said basically it was BS that the fans were acting the way that they were. And I would just ask the question to Nick Saban: if you lost to Auburn 4 years in a row, do you think Alabama fans would have been the same way? Right? Like, this is not a thing that is reserved to Ohio State and their fan base. And I also think that fans of these prestigious, proud programs are allowed to feel this way, right? Like, it doesn't mean that the athletic department has to make a decision based off of the feelings of the fans, but people are allowed to be emotional about the program they love. They spend money traveling to follow these guys. They buy tickets, they buy apparel. Like, they're invested in it to a certain degree, and it's okay to be emotional.
Yeah, and now more than ever before, athletes are like funding it. They are part of these collectives. They are part of these NIL deals for the players. And like, that's part of the reason the expectations were so high at Ohio State. Like, everybody went all in to retain talent, to help bring in great talent. I'm with you. I find it, very condescending to
Yes.
think that fans and their reactions and their feelings about a rivalry that we, both me and you, consider the best in the entire country, that wouldn't be enough for people to be upset by. And that you would have to be, a lunatic. You have to be in the fringe of the fan base to feel that way when there is an expectation and a standard at this place. It's different. I was talking about this the last 24 hours about when Michigan lost to Ohio State over and over again in Harbaugh's tenure. Now, Jim Harbaugh did end up having to restructure his contract and take a lot less money because he couldn't beat Ohio State. But also Michigan had lost 14 out of 15 games or something like that. Like, it wasn't the same level of urgency that it is for Ohio State right now after dominating the rivalry for a really long time to then suddenly not win those games. It's okay for that to be a huge deal to a lot of people. That's why these coaches are paid what they are. And that's why these rivalry games are what they are in the fabric of the sport, is that they mean a lot. And, the idea that you could still make the playoff. This was a conversation people were saying about devaluing the game. The game wasn't devalued. The sky was falling in Columbus afterwards. And there was a brawl on the field, like a fight on the field or practice, whatever we want to call it, a scuffle on the field afterwards, because it matters so much to people. And I think that it is reasonable that fans would be upset by that performance. And again, it wasn't on the players. They were upset with the game plan, the way that was handled. They were also upset with the way that Ryan Day was during the scuffle on the field, not involved, not pulling guys away, not getting involved in it. Those were valid points to make. Those are valid things to feel as a fan base. And again, I keep coming back to what you just started that by saying, you're allowed to have standards and expectations for your program when you're Ohio State.
I think the programs where the fans aren't this invested and the fans are apathetic, those are the ones you want to avoid. That's when people stop donating. That's when people stop watching. That's when, nobody's showing up and they don't care what happens. It's a really tough existence. And I understand everything he was saying about Ryan Day and how hard it's been. I grew up where Ryan Day currently lives, and they've got security detail outside of his home because those are the real fringe lunatics, the ones that want to make threats. That's lunacy. But the idea of saying that, hey, we need to beat Michigan in a year where we are significantly better than them, and we know we can, no problem. No problem with that.
And that's part of the reason that, like, even after that loss, is you say, like, how's he going to get through the next 11 months after a 4th straight loss to Michigan? Well, go out and win a national championship, right? Well, This was step one. This was the response that everyone was looking for from this team, from the coaching staff. And they did it, right? They showed us why you could believe that they can win a national championship. So again, they do have this opportunity, the second lease on life. And we'll see. It's going to be an awesome Rose Bowl. But before we go, we have to show a WTF moment, which is also from Columbus. We saw this at a couple places. There were a couple players who were wandering around shirtless before the Notre Dame game, but not quite like Tennessee did. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see this. But it was like, I don't know, it's just like 20, 25, 30 players came out for Tennessee without shirts on. They're doing their warm-up.
All the big guys.
The big guys. Yeah, it's like 80 minutes before kickoff. They got their little bands out there. They cut to the SEC network desk. They're all bundled up. They've got, like, their earmuffs on, and these guys are all shirtless. Man, this stuff drives me crazy. I kind of understand why you think you're doing it to, like, prove you're tough and you're not scared. But man, that's a bad look when then you got blown out like 80 minutes later. Yeah.
So I'll say this, like, there were a lot of Tennessee fans that were online giving us meteorological education about the climate there in Tennessee. We understand that it does get cold there. It ain't like being in the Midwest. I think that was the point of having, like, the conversation about how do these guys handle it. And where's your roster from too? Like, some of these guys are, if you're from California, you may have never played a cold weather game. Like, at least the guys who play for Ohio State that are from the South have played in cold weather. Neither here nor there. 2 comments. Number 1, it's crazy. I get it. We shouldn't do it. Like, you don't have to prove to me that.
Have you ever done that? Have you ever run out there?
Never. Okay. And I'll tell you, the one time I played in a game that was super cold, we played at Minnesota. I wore sleeves. I got to be comfortable to be able to ball out. And I had a bunch of tackles that game, but I wasn't going to have a bunch of tackles if I was freezing my tail off. So, like, I do what you got to do to be comfortable, I guess, is message number 1. But number 2, if you're going to do the shirtless thing and to prove that you can handle the cold, don't lather yourself in Vaseline as an occlusive buffer layer to your skin to try to block out the cold. It almost defeats the purpose to me. It's like, I'm going to come out here shirtless, but make sure I got my layer of Vaseline on. I'm like, come on, guys.
Is the Vaseline thing a thing?
It's a thing.
Okay. It does keep you warmer?
I don't know. I never did it.
It helps you glow when you come out there.
I didn't want to be slippery, and slide off of a tackle. Opening up tackling school. Rule number 1, no Vaseline.
It was funny. I think so a couple of Notre Dame players were doing that, and then, like, Jeremiah Love was interviewed before the game, and he was like, I don't know why they're doing that. That's dumb. Like, I'm wearing, like, he was dressed like a normal person. And I was like, that sounds like Joshua. This isn't Joshua. Don't associate me with those guys who are shirtless. I'm prepared. I'm warm. I'm doing what I need to do for this game.
I'm glad he said it, because I was thinking it, and I'm a hater, is my brand, but that's dumb. Like, just go play the game. Be comfortable.
I know. And it reminded me too. There was, like, a game a few years back when it was Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech, where he had them, like, lifting weights. They brought, like, barbells on the sideline, and everyone's like, well, that seems silly. Is that supposed to be intimidating, or, like, what is that supposed to be? And then they lost. And it was like, well, that backfired. Just prepare, dress how you need to dress, wear the layers that you need to wear. And
do your normal routine. Do what you do that makes you successful every time.
The good news is that all of the remaining games should be pretty warm. They're either in domes or they are at the Rose Bowl, Fiesta Bowl.
You know that Rose Bowl, when the sun sets, though, it gets chilly out there.
True. Okay, so the good news is neither Ohio State nor Oregon players were the ones who were running around shirtless this weekend. So they will be prepared. And we get, honestly, a classic Rose Bowl, a Pac-12, Big Ten, Oregon, Ohio State Rose Bowl. It's gonna be awesome. We will have plenty more rushing the field as we get closer and closer to this quarterfinal games. Joshua and I will have previews and recaps, reaction pods just like this one the rest of the way for the CFP. We appreciate you guys listening, discussing, thinking about these games, and hopefully we get some close ones in the next round. For Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Thanks for hanging with us on Rushing the Field, and we'll be back soon.